Hey, this is Jamie from Stonemaier Games, and today I'm excited to talk to you about the first game that I designed and published, and that is Viticulture. I'm actually talking about things in the context of viticulture. I'm going to share, if you love viticulture, basically, I'm going to talk about 10 games that I think you might also really enjoy, and I'll do that by focusing on 10 things that I think make viticulture work, or make it hopefully work well in a number of respects, and things that make viticulture unique. I've saved kind of the most unique things for the top five, and then the bottom five are still important things to viticulture, but maybe not the things that completely differentiate it from other worker placement games. I guess the core basics of Viticulture is a 1 to 6 player game where you are managing a vineyard. It is a worker placement game, so you're placing workers where other players cannot also place their workers. And it's mentioned that it scales from 1 to 6. Yeah, and it's competitive. Those are the core aspects of Viticulture. So let me jump in and say at number 10, I'm going to talk about Dune Imperium. Dune Imperium is a game that I really, really love. It is a worker placement game, and so a lot of the games on this list are worker placement games. But I mention it specifically because one of the things that I really like about Viticulture is how it has a somewhat organic endgame condition that feels a little bit like a race, but the person to complete the race may not necessarily be the winner. That is, in Viticulture, you're trying to get to 20 victory points, or 25 when you play with the Tuscany expansion. And when you do that, hopefully I'm not messing that up. 20, 25. You're trying to get to a certain number of victory points in Viticulture. Let me look on the game board to make sure. And when any player reaches that victory point threshold, let's see what it is. You were trying to get to, I should know this, it's my own game, but because I changed it with Tuscany, 20. Okay, I was right. So 20, Tuscany is 25. When you get to 25 victory points, when any player does, all other players still finish the year. All players finish that year of the game, and then you look at the final score. So that's one thing that Viticulture does. So it kind of, you don't play Viticulture for a set number of rounds. You typically play for between 6 to 8 rounds or years in the game, but it really depends on what the players do to determine the pace of the game. And Dune Imperium does a very similar thing. Dune Imperium does have a set number of rounds, 10 rounds, but that's kind of like a backup. Usually games of Dune Imperium end when any player reaches 10 victory points, and then you finish that round, and the player who has the most victory points at the end of that round is the winner. So every victory point is very precious in Dune, and that is the same case in Viticulture, even though there are a few more victory points in the game. But I really like that giving the players the control of how long the game takes, and how the tension that it adds, because it means that every victory point not only matters for your ability to win the game, but also for your ability to end the game at the right time. It also leads to some tough decisions later in the game when you're trying to decide, should I push for ending the game right now? Should I push for points this round? Or should I push to build my engine just a little bit more and then go for points in the next round? And so it really gets you to pay attention to the other players and see if the time is right to push towards the end of the game and get points versus engine building. I'm talking about Viticulture there in that context, but that is the same thing in Dune Imperium. So that's number 10. At number 9 on the list, I have Everdell, which I think in terms of how Everdell feels, it's very similar to Viticulture. Very different worlds. Everdell is kind of a fantasy, animal-driven world. Viticulture is set in Tuscany with humans in it, but they both have kind of a romanticized look and feel to them. And one of the things that I really love about Everdell is the sheer variety of the cards in the game, both the building cards and the critter cards in the game that you are obtaining and using to build your village. There's an amazing variety of those cards, and for Viticulture, we also have quite a few visitor cards in the game. There are also vine cards and wine order cards, but I designed quite a number of visitor cards that lead to unique abilities, little short-term goals, special moments where you get to feel powerful when you play those cards. And I feel the same way when I play Everdell. When I play those cards, I feel powerful. I feel special. I feel like you do have to pay for many of the cards in Everdell. You don't have to pay to play visitor cards in Viticulture. You just have to go to a certain action space. But the payoff feels very similar between these two games. I'm also really impressed by any designer who can design a ton of unique cards. It's why I was drawn to Wingspan from Elizabeth Hargrave. And I'm impressed by that in Everdell, and really any game where the designer comes up with a ton of unique cards. That is a difficult skill for me as a designer, and so I'm impressed when anyone else is able to do that, especially in a thematic way. Everdell is number 8 on this list, or number 9 on this list. At number 8, I have a game that I own digitally, but not in cardboard form, and that is Lords of Waterdeep. yet another worker placement game. Lords of Waterdeep has one thing that has a number of things that I really like. The thing that I want to connect it to Viticulture is the mission contract fulfillment aspect of Lords of Waterdeep is different than Viticulture, but it still has a similar feel to it. So in Viticulture, one of the core things you're trying to do are get wine orders. So you have these wine orders that you gain, and then at some point in the game, ideally, you will complete those wine orders. You'll fill those wine orders by discarding some wine from your cellar and completing those orders, and you get points, and maybe you get a little bit of a residual money payment for doing so. In Lords of Waterdeep, missions are almost the driving force of the game. You're trying to gather resources so you can complete these missions, and every turn you're allowed to complete a mission. You're allowed to complete one mission per turn. You don't have to take a special action to do that in Lords of Waterdeep. I just love the mission system in Lords of Waterdeep, and I wanted to pick a game that had a mission system like that because it is such a big part of the driving force. It's what you're building up to in Viticulture. And in Lords of Waterdeep, you're also building up to these missions. The thing that I actually like about Lords of Waterdeep missions, even more than Viticulture missions, or contracts, whatever they're called, quests, I think they're called quests in Lords of Waterdeep, is that quests don't just give you points in Lords of Waterdeep. They often give you more resources, so you can string that into your next turn, your next quest. They might give you a special ability that's ongoing. They might give you something else that you need to move forward. So it's not just points; they're giving you something else to move forward and progress in the game. So that is Lords of Waterdeep at number 8 in relation to the quest system and the wine orders in Viticulture. And number 7 is Russian Railroads, yet another worker placement game on this list. Russian Railroads came to mind specifically as a tie to Viticulture because of the order of operation system that is so integral to Viticulture. So in Viticulture, there are many steps that you're doing. You're constructing buildings. Actually, you're getting money so that you can construct buildings so that you can plant vines, and then you're harvesting grapes from those vines, and then you're turning those grapes into wine, and then you're turning that wine into wine orders. So all these, it's this very order of operations game where you're trying to optimize different levels of those operations. You might really focus on one more than the other, but all the while, if you're trying to make wine and sell wine orders, you have to go through this process. And every time you've completed like one aspect of that process, you don't have to worry about it quite as much anymore. There are some exceptions to that, like you need to harvest continually throughout the game to get more grapes off those vine cards that you've planted. But once you plant a vine card, it stays there on the field. Once you construct a building, it stays there for the rest of the game. So there's this sense of engine building to it. You're doing a lot of this on your little vineyard mat and here in Viticulture. And in Russian Railroads, I have a very similar sense of progression and order of operations. So you do take these worker placement action spots that help you move your train tracks forward, but oftentimes you can look ahead and say, okay, I really want to move this specific type of train forward, but to do that, I need to first move this other type of train forward, and to do that, I need to do this other thing. And when I get to this point in the track that's going to trigger this ability, I want to work towards that. So you have these little payoffs on the tracks that require multiple turns to build up to over the course of the game. And once you establish those boundaries, once you've moved a train up to a certain place on the track, it's never going to move back. You have that benefit for the rest of the game. So yeah, Russian Railroads I thought was a fun connection to the order of operations element of Viticulture. So that's Russian Railroads at number 7. At number 6, we have Agricola. Agricola was one of the games that I played a ton when I got into modern gaming around, 10, 15 years ago. It feels like 15 years. I don't know if it was quite that long. I first played Catan, and then I got into Agricola. And so Agricola had a major influence on Viticulture's design in a number of different ways, from the worker placement to the way the actual worker placement actions worked. And the biggest way that it had an impact is that you have your own mat to control. And I consider this an asset. I actually just heard a reviewer talking about the other day about how too many games have players looking at their own little tableau rather than the interface where they're interacting with other players. And while, yeah, I like the board in Viticulture where you're interacting with other players, I love that I have my own little private place that no one can mess with. That feels really good to me. Even when I'm at the table with other players, I like that I have my own vineyard and no one can mess with that. I can build this up as I wish. It's my place. And I want to connect that to Agricola, because in Agricola, you have your own little farm mat where you're building your house, you're building out your farm, you're planting, you're building fences, you're getting animals to hang out and mate on your little farm, and no one can hurt your farm. It's your happy place, especially in a game type where there's so many different interactions on the board, both in Viticulture and Agricola, the shared space. There's so many interactions there that it's nice to be able to have complete control, complete agency over my own little vineyard mat. And I feel the same way about Agricola. And plus, I wanted to mention it because it was such a major influence for designing viticulture. So that's Agricola at number 6. At number 5, I think we've done all worker placement so far. I do have one game on this list that isn't worker placement. It's coming up in a second. But before I get there, Stone Age at number 5. Stone Age I'm putting on the list at least partially because it was another game that was a major influence on viticulture. I played Stone Age right when I was designing viticulture back in 2011, 2012, around there. And Stone Age is a very different worker placement game that you're placing workers and not gaining the benefits until the end of the round. Opposed to viticulture, where you place a worker, you get the benefit right away. But with Stone Age, the connection I want to make here is that one of the big assets, I think, in viticulture, one of the interesting things about it is the seasonal breakdown. So, especially in terms of worker placement. So, in the summer in viticulture, you can place workers, but those workers stay on those action spaces. They don't come off the summer when it turns time for winter. Thematically, I don't know if that even makes all that much sense, but it works for the game. It works for the game mechanisms because you have to decide: do I want to save workers for the winter, or do I want to use those workers right now in the summer? Every year, I find that to be a compelling decision. And oftentimes, the summer actions are more built around building up your vineyard, whereas the winter actions are more about the payoff. But there's other actions like harvesting is an important part, but you're not really getting anything directly out of the harvest that'll move you toward. Well, it will move you towards victory points, but it won't directly give you victory points. But I really like the seasonal breakdown that you don't get the workers back at the end of summer, that they are committed to that summer job throughout the end of the year, and then you need to decide if you want to save workers for the winter. It also gives you a reason to pay attention to other players. If you see a lot of players saving up a bunch of workers for the winter, you might take an opportunity to use them in the summer, or vice versa. And I'm connecting this back to Stone Age. Stone Age is a game where you have a bunch of workers and you are kind of deciding throughout the worker placement phase of the game, am I going to use a bunch of workers right now and take up a bunch of spaces on, like, say, the place where you gather gold? Or am I going to save some workers for later, maybe spread them out? Am I going to take some of these very limited action spaces, like the mating hut or the agriculture track in Stone Age? Am I going to claim a building to construct later? Or am I going to put those workers out on the board? So you're constantly deciding, how many workers do I want to use right now, and where do I want to place them, and where do I want to place them a little bit later in this worker placement phase. Stone Age is number 5 on this list. In this style of top 10, I like to mention one Stonemaier game. And so the Stonemaier game that I picked, if you love viticulture, is I think you will also really enjoy Tapestry. This was kind of a tough pick because we have other worker placement games. I have Charterstone and Euphoria and Pendulum. We have 3 worker placement games, 2 of which were designed by me. And I could have mentioned them, but I think Tapestry has the most similar feel to viticulture, specifically in terms of an aspect of abundance. So I designed viticulture specifically so that you feel like you're getting a lot of stuff all the time. You have bonus action spaces where you're placing workers on and getting those bonuses. You have the wake-up track. You don't have to do anything to place it on the wake-up track. Everyone gets to do it. You get to go on the wake-up track and you get a bonus. Everything you're doing is gaining more and more stuff. You also get an abundance of cards. Like every fall season in viticulture, you just get a card. You get a visitor card. They come to visit you. You don't have to do anything. So the game is giving you all this stuff, and you're trying to decide which stuff to use and when to use it. And Tapestry, while it's a very different game, and it isn't a worker placement game, I feel has the same aspect. You are constantly getting an abundance of stuff in Tapestry, particularly during your income turns, but also during your standard advancement turns in the game. And you're deciding what to do with that stuff and when to use that stuff. And I think that's a really important part of viticulture because we have a random card draw in viticulture. You're randomly drawing a vine card. You're randomly drawing visitor cards. You don't know what you're going to get. And in a game where if those resources are really scarce and really difficult to get, I think it would be really important for those cards to be face up. But in viticulture, you're getting a ton of those cards all the time. You're getting a ton of stuff all the time. And you're deciding when you need to use that stuff or which of that stuff you need to use at any given time. That I think correlates directly to Tapestry. If you enjoy viticulture, I think you'll also really enjoy Tapestry. That's number 4 on my list. At number 3, I have another, back to worker placement for the rest of the list, Architects of the West Kingdom. This is my favorite game in this line of games from Shem Phillips, from Garp Hill Games. I love Architects of the West Kingdom, and the reason I wanted to mention it today is because of the grande worker in viticulture. I really love how the grande worker works. And it's something that I didn't realize right away. In the very initial design of viticulture, once I got to the worker placement aspect of the game, I didn't have the grande worker in it. It was actually part of an expansion originally, and then in the original Kickstarter back in 2012. And then I incorporated it into the second edition and finally the Essential Edition. And And this grande worker basically says, even if the worker placement action spaces are blocked, you can still place a grande worker on this action. And also, if the action spaces are available, you can place the grande like a regular worker on one of those spaces. But it gives you a lot of freedom in viticulture. And the correlation to architects is that you have a lot of freedom in architects as to when you can place where you can place workers. In fact, there is no blocking really in architects. There might be a few limited action spaces, but most of them are action spaces where you can place workers, and you can even accumulate workers on those action spaces. And I really like the freedom here. I think Shem shows here that you can have worker placement without blocking, where you can always place on an action and still have a satisfying worker placement puzzle to accomplish. He does some really cool things even beyond viticulture with the worker placement, where as you place workers on these action spaces, the more workers you have on many of them, the better the benefit. So if on a previous turn I'd already placed some workers on an action and I place another worker there, that action gets even better for me. But in general, the connection here is to the grande worker specifically, that you have access, you can use that grande worker to have access to different actions at any time. And you can't be blocked. The grande worker just cannot be blocked, similar to how you cannot be blocked for most of the actions in Architects of the West Kingdom. That's Architects at number 3. At number 2, I have a worker placement game that I haven't gotten to the table in a while, but I really used to enjoy Tzolk'in, and I still do enjoy Tzolk'in. And the major thing that I think of when I think of Tzolk'in is that you get to put down these workers on these dials. Here's the dials in the back of the board. And then those workers just sit there, and the dials turn and they move forward, and your benefits for those workers get better and better until you decide, okay, I really want that benefit, I'm going to pull the worker off. And the key connection here to viticulture is the idea of passive benefits, where you have done something and then you just you reap the progression of that benefit on an ongoing basis without having to do anything. That's the passive nature of it. In viticulture, when you get grape and wine tokens on your crush pad and in your cellar, they're there and they're going to age on their own. So every year they're going to gain value. They're going to gain more and more valuable. The grape tokens will always gain value. There's nothing blocking them. You are limited by your cellar space and the types of cellars you have in the wine cellar. But once you construct your medium and large cellar, those wine tokens are just going to age on their own from year to year. And I think this is really, really important to making viticulture function. That you have these passive benefits that you're gaining without having to do anything. It feels good. All you've done is you've harvested that field one time. You've gotten the grapes from that field or grape token, 1 or 2 grape tokens, and you get to watch those grape tokens accumulate in value without having to do anything. And the same thing happens in Tzolk'in, where you place those workers on these dials, and without you having to do anything other than wait, your workers get more and more valuable as they're on their dials, or at least the benefits from pulling those workers off get more and more valuable. Yeah, I love this aspect of passive benefits in both Tzolk'in and viticulture. And so that's why this game is my number 2 on this list, because that's a pretty big thing about viticulture. And the number 1 thing that I want to mention about viticulture is the wake-up track. I mentioned it very briefly before, but you have this thing in viticulture that you're doing where you have a wake-up track in the spring. You get to place your rooster there and you get a benefit. And that determines which player is going to go first in every following season for that year. And I took this from another game that has a very similar wake-up track, Fresco. Fresco was had a direct impact on viticulture. I played Fresco while I was designing viticulture, and I saw that wake-up track, and I loved the idea of it. I would say it's thematically integrated in Fresco even better than it is in viticulture. I highly recommend trying Fresco so you can see how that works. But you place a worker on the wake-up track in Fresco, or not a worker, you place a token on the wake-up track in Fresco, and it gives you a couple different benefits, and oftentimes it means that you have to actually pay more for those workers. There's some payments even on those slots. I wanted to make it just a reward in viticulture, and so there's no payment that goes along with the slot that you select on that wake-up track, other than deciding, okay, do I want to go really early and get the highest priority on these actions when I place my first worker in the summer or in the winter? Or do I want to go late and risk maybe not getting the exact action I want, but I get a better wake-up benefit? So I love that decision. I love that players have the turn order decision in viticulture. The one tricky thing I will say about mechanisms like this is that it means that you have to constantly remind players whose turn it is. Because you don't have that clockwise flow of the game from turn to turn. But once you get into the flow of it and you're saying, okay, I'm done, Jamie, it's your turn, Megan, it's your turn, it does end up working, I think, pretty well. But I borrowed that directly from Fresco. I used it in a slightly different way, but if you like the wake up mechanism in Viticulture, I highly recommend checking out Fresco, and that's why it is my #1 game that I'd recommend if you also really love Viticulture. Those are my games. I'd love to hear your thoughts. If you've played Viticulture and then had success with people who like Viticulture, maybe introduced another game to them that you thought was related, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. And if there's any mechanism in Viticulture that I've missed that you'd really that you think is worth highlighting, I'd love to hear about that in the comments below as well. Not to boost my ego, but because I can learn from that as a designer and maybe incorporate that aspect of Viticulture in some of our other games in the future. All right, thanks.